The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 3B creaked as people filed in that Tuesday morning. Outside, rain tapped against the tall windows, making everything feel gray and somber. Inside, the room buzzed with quiet conversations and the rustling of papers. This wasn't just any ordinary day at the courthouse. Today would decide where an 8-year-old girl would spend the rest of her childhood. Little Sophie sat on the hard wooden bench, her legs barely reaching the floor. She wore her best dress, the blue one with tiny flowers that her mom had picked out specially for today. Her small hands gripped the edge of the bench as she watched all the grown-ups in their dark suits talking in hushed voices. She didn't understand all the big words they used, but she knew they were talking about her. They were deciding her future, and somehow she had no say in it. Judge Williams entered the courtroom with his long black robe flowing behind him. Everyone stood up quickly, chairs scraping against the floor. Sophie jumped up too, copying what everyone else did. The judge was an older man with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. He looked serious and important, the kind of person who made decisions that changed people's lives every single day. "Be seated," Judge Williams said in his deep voice that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Everyone sat down with a collective whoosh of fabric and creaking chairs. Sophie's mom, Lisa, sat 3 rows behind her, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. On the other side of the room sat Sophie's father, Michael, looking confident in his expensive suit and shiny shoes. The case had been going on for months now. Ever since her parents got divorced 2 years ago, they couldn't agree on anything, especially where Sophie should live. At first, they had shared custody. She would spend weekdays with her mom and weekends with her dad. But recently, her father had asked the court to change everything. He wanted Sophie to live with him most of the time. Sophie's father's lawyer stood up first. He was a tall man who spoke in a loud, clear voice that made everyone pay attention. "Your Honor," he began, "my client can provide the stability and financial security that every child deserves. He has a steady job as a regional manager at a successful company, owns his home outright, and has never missed a child support payment." The lawyer walked around the courtroom as he talked, gesturing with his hands to make his points seem more important. The child's mother, while well-meaning, simply cannot provide the same level of stability. She lost her job 8 months ago and has been struggling to find steady work since then. Sophie watched her mom's face crumple a little more with each word. It was true that her mom had lost her job when the small bookstore where she worked had to close down. Since then, she had been working different jobs, sometimes cleaning offices at night, sometimes serving food at a local diner. Money was always tight, and Sophie knew it, because she heard her mom on the phone sometimes worried about paying bills. But Sophie also knew things the lawyer didn't mention. She knew that her mom made the best pancakes on Sunday mornings, shaped like animals and faces that made Sophie giggle. She knew that when she had bad dreams, her mom would sit beside her bed and sing soft songs until she fell back asleep. She knew that her mom helped her with homework every night at their small kitchen table, even when she was tired from working all day. The judge listened carefully, taking notes on a yellow pad. His face didn't show what he was thinking, but Sophie could see him nodding slightly when her father's lawyer talked about money and houses and stability. Judge Williams had probably heard cases like this hundreds of times before. Usually, it came down to simple questions. Who had more money? Who had a bigger house? Who looked better on paper? "Furthermore, Your Honor," the lawyer continued, "my client has recently remarried to a lovely woman who has expressed great interest in helping to raise the child. She's a registered nurse with a stable income, and together they can provide a 2-parent household that every child needs for proper development." Sophie remembered meeting her dad's new wife, Jennifer, a few times. She seemed nice enough, always smiling and asking Sophie about school. But there was something about her smile that felt different from her mom's smile. Jennifer's smile seemed practiced, like she had to remember to do it. Her mom's smile just happened naturally, especially when she looked at Sophie. When it was time for Sophie's mom's lawyer to speak, the difference was obvious right away. This lawyer was younger, and his suit wasn't as expensive. He shuffled through his papers nervously before standing up. "Your Honor, my client may not have the financial resources of her ex-husband, But she has something equally important, an unbreakable bond with her daughter. He talked about how Sophie called her mom first whenever she got hurt or scared. He mentioned the bedtime stories they shared every night, and how Sophie had never missed a day of school when she was staying with her mom. But even as he spoke, Sophie could see that his words didn't seem to carry the same weight as the other lawyers' talk about money and houses. Mrs. Patterson works multiple jobs to make ends meet, showing incredible determination and work ethic. Yes, she lives in a smaller apartment, but it's clean, safe, and filled with love. Sometimes the most important things can't be measured in dollars and cents. Sophie looked around the courtroom and saw people checking their phones and whispering to each other. It seemed like they had already made up their minds. The judge kept glancing at a thick folder on his desk, probably full of financial documents and reports that made her dad look like the obvious choice. During a brief break, Sophie watched her parents from across the room. Her dad was talking confidently with his lawyer, gesturing with his hands and occasionally laughing at something. He looked relaxed, like someone who knew he was going to win. Her mom sat quietly, staring at her hands folded in her lap. Sophie wanted to run over and hug her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But the court officer had told her to stay in her seat. When court resumed, Judge Williams asked to review some financial documents. Sophie watched him flip through pages and pages of numbers, bank statements, pay stubs, property values, and investment accounts. Everything that was supposed to prove who would be the better parent was written down in black and white. But Sophie knew there were other things that couldn't be written down on any paper. Things like how her mom always remembered to pack her favorite snacks for school trips, or how she never got impatient when Sophie asked the same question over and over again. Things like how her mom knew exactly what to say when Sophie felt sad about her parents' divorce, or how she always made sure Sophie felt loved and wanted, even when money was tight. As the morning dragged on, Sophie could feel something heavy settling in her stomach. The grown-ups were talking about her like she was a piece of furniture to be moved from one house to another. They talked about the child, and custody arrangements, and financial obligations. But none of them asked Sophie what she wanted, or how she felt. The judge was getting ready to announce his preliminary decision, and from the way he kept looking at her father's financial documents, Sophie could guess which way this was going to go. When Lisa's name was called to take the witness stand, Sophie watched her mom's hand shake as she stood up. The courtroom suddenly felt bigger and quieter, like everyone was holding their breath. Lisa walked slowly to the front of the room, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the expensive suits around her. She placed her hand on the Bible and promised to tell the truth, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Sophie had never seen her mom look so small and vulnerable before. At home, her mom was always the strong one, the one who fixed broken toys, chased away monsters from under the bed, and somehow always found a way to put food on the table, even when money was running low. But here, surrounded by lawyers and legal papers, she looked like a completely different person. "Please state your full name for the record," said her lawyer, trying to give her an easy question to start with. "Lisa Marie Patterson," she replied, her voice growing slightly stronger. She looked across the courtroom and caught Sophie's eye for just a moment. Sophie tried to give her an encouraging smile, the way her mom always did when Sophie was nervous about something at school. "Mrs. Patterson, can you tell the court about your relationship with your daughter?" the lawyer asked gently. Lisa's face softened immediately, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she looked like the mom Sophie knew and loved. "Sophie is everything to me," she began, her voice filled with warmth. "She's been my whole world since the day she was born. Every morning when she wakes up, she runs to my room and tells me about her dreams. Every night we read together before bed, and she always wants to hear just one more story." As Lisa spoke, Sophie remembered those bedtime stories. Her mom didn't just read from books. She made up stories about brave princesses and talking animals. Stories where Sophie was always the hero who saved the day. Sometimes they would act out the stories, using pillows as mountains and blankets as magical forests. "We have traditions," Lisa continued, her voice becoming more confident. "Every Sunday we make pancakes together. Sophie likes to help crack the eggs, even though she usually gets some shell in the bowl. We laugh about it, every time. And every Friday night is movie night. We make popcorn and build a fort out of couch cushions. Sophie could see some people in the courtroom smiling at this description, but she also noticed others checking their watches or looking bored. They didn't understand that these weren't just silly activities. They were the moments that made Sophie feel safe and loved. "Mrs. Patterson," the lawyer continued, "there have been allegations that your current living situation is unstable. Can you address these concerns?" Lisa's shoulders tensed up again. This was the part she had been dreading. "It's true that I lost my job 8 months ago when the bookstore closed down, but I've been working constantly to provide for Sophie. I work at 3 different places now. I clean offices on Monday and Wednesday nights. I serve food at Romano's, diner on weekends, and I help out at the community center whenever they need extra help." Sophie knew about all those jobs because sometimes she had to stay with neighbors or do homework at the diner while her mom worked. She remembered sitting in a corner booth, coloring pictures while her mom served customers with a tired smile. Even when her mom was exhausted, she always made time to help Sophie with her math homework or listen to her talk about her day at school. "The apartment we live in might be small," Lisa said, her voice getting stronger again, "but it's clean and safe. Sophie has her own room with a window that looks out at the playground. She's decorated it with her artwork and photos from our trips to the zoo and the museum. It's not fancy, but it's filled with love." Michael's lawyer had been waiting for his turn, and Sophie could see him getting ready to pounce. When Lisa's lawyer finished asking questions, the other lawyer stood up with a confident smile that made Sophie's stomach feel funny. "Mrs. Patterson," he began in a voice that sounded friendly but somehow felt dangerous, "you mentioned working multiple jobs. How many hours per week would you say you're away from home?" Lisa shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "It varies, but I try to make sure I'm always home when Sophie gets back from school. But that doesn't answer my question. How many hours per week are you working? Maybe 40 or 50 hours, but they're spread out so that 50 hours a week," the lawyer interrupted, turning to face the judge. "That's more than most full-time jobs, Your Honor. And these are evening and weekend hours, exactly when a child needs supervision and attention." Sophie wanted to jump up and tell everyone that her mom was always there when she needed her. Yes, her mom worked a lot, but she never missed a school play or forgot to pack lunch. When Sophie was sick, her mom would skip work to take care of her, even though Sophie knew they needed the money. "Mrs. Patterson, you mentioned your daughter has her own room. How large is this room?" It's small, but she has space for her bed and her desk and her toys." "How small? Would you say it's smaller than a walk-in closet in most homes?" Lisa's face reddened. "Size isn't everything. Sophie is happy there. She's never complained about—" "I'm asking about size, Mrs. Patterson. Please answer the question." Sophie could see tears forming in her mom's eyes. The lawyer was making their cozy little apartment sound like some kind of prison, when really it was the place where Sophie felt most safe and loved in the whole world. "And your income, Mrs. Patterson? What would you say your monthly income is, from all these various jobs?" This was the question Lisa had been dreading most. Sophie knew they didn't have much money, because she had overheard phone conversations about overdue bills and trips to the discount grocery store. But she also knew that her mom somehow always made sure Sophie had what she needed: school supplies, clothes that fit, birthday parties with homemade cake. "It varies," Lisa said quietly. "Some months are better than others. But on average, Mrs. Patterson, the court needs to understand the financial reality of your situation." When Lisa finally gave the number, it sounded impossibly small in the formal courtroom. Sophie watched as the judge wrote it down and compared it to other papers on his desk, probably the financial documents from her father that showed much bigger numbers. "Mrs. Patterson, with such limited income and working such long hours, how can you honestly say you can provide the stability and opportunities that a child needs?" Lisa looked like she had been slapped. For a moment she just sat there, tears streaming down her face. Sophie had never seen her mom cry in public before, and it made her own eyes fill with tears. "I may not have a lot of money," Lisa finally said, her voice shaking but determined, "but I have love. I know my daughter better than anyone else in this world. I know that she's afraid of thunderstorms but loves the sound of rain on the window. I know that she still sleeps with the stuffed rabbit I gave her when she was 2 years old. I know that when she's upset, she draws pictures, and when she's happy, She sings songs she makes up herself. But Sophie could see that the judge was looking at his papers again, at those numbers that made her dad seem like the obvious choice. In the back of the courtroom, her father sat looking confident, occasionally whispering something to his new wife that made her nod and smile. As her mom stepped down from the witness stand, Sophie could see the defeat in her shoulders. The lawyer had made her sound like she was failing as a mother, when Sophie knew the exact opposite was true. Her mom was the strongest, most loving person she knew, but somehow none of that seemed to matter in this cold, formal room where everything was decided by numbers on pieces of paper. When Michael's name was called to take the witness stand, he walked up with the confidence of someone who knew he was going to win. His expensive suit was perfectly pressed, his shoes polished to a shine, and his smile looked practiced and professional. Sophie watched from her seat as her father placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The irony of that moment would become clear much later. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," his lawyer began. "Michael James Patterson, Regional Sales Manager for Atlantic Industries," he replied in a clear, strong voice that filled the courtroom. Everything about his presentation screamed success and stability, exactly what the court wanted to see. "Mr. Patterson, can you tell the court about your current living situation and how it would benefit your daughter?" Michael straightened up in his chair, looking directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I own a 4-bedroom house in Maplewood Gardens, one of the safest neighborhoods in the city. The house has a large backyard where Sophie can play safely, and it's in the district with the best schools. My daughter would have her own room twice the size of where she's living now, with space for study, play, and having friends over." Sophie remembered that house. It was big and impressive, with white columns and a perfectly manicured lawn. But she also remembered how quiet and cold it felt inside. The furniture looked like it came from a magazine, beautiful but not meant to be touched or lived in. Her room there had expensive furniture and fancy decorations, but it never felt like her room. It felt like a display in a furniture store. "I've recently married Jennifer, who is a registered nurse at City General Hospital. She brings additional stability and income to our household, and she's eager to help raise Sophie. Together we can provide a 2-parent home with a combined income that will ensure Sophie never wants for anything." As her father spoke, Sophie's mind wandered to the time she had spent weekends at that big, impressive house. Jennifer was always polite and asked about school, but there was something cold about her attention. It felt forced, like she was playing a role she had memorized, but didn't really feel. "Your Honor, I can provide Sophie with private tutoring, music lessons, sports activities, summer camps, all the opportunities that will help her succeed in life. I have a college fund already set up for her with enough money to pay for any university she chooses to attend." The judge nodded approvingly as he listened. These were the kinds of concrete benefits that looked good on paper and made sense in a courtroom. Michael painted a picture of a life where Sophie would have every advantage money could buy. But Sophie knew things about her father that nobody else in that courtroom knew. She knew about the smell on his breath when he picked her up for weekend visits, a sharp, bitter smell that made her stomach feel nervous. She knew about the way his voice changed when he had been drinking, how it got louder and meaner, especially when he talked on the phone with her mother. She remembered one Saturday morning when she had woken up early and gone downstairs to find something to eat. Her father was in the kitchen with 2 of his friends, and there were empty bottles on the counter. They were talking loudly and laughing in a way that made Sophie feel scared, so she had tried to sneak back upstairs without being seen. "Sophie, get over here," her father had called out when he spotted her. His voice had that different tone, the one that made her feel small and nervous. "Come meet my friends." Sophie had walked over slowly, staying as far away as she could while still being polite. One of the men had grabbed her arm and pulled her closer, asking her questions about school, in a voice that sounded friendly but felt wrong somehow. When she tried to pull away, he had held on tighter, and she could see her father laughing like it was all just a funny game. "Dad, you're hurting me," she had said quietly. But he just told her not to be such a baby. The bruises on her arm had lasted for almost a week, but when her mother asked about them, Sophie had made up a story about falling off her bike. She was afraid of what might happen if she told the truth. Mr. Patterson, his lawyer continued, can you describe your relationship with your daughter? How do you spend time together? Michael's face lit up with what looked like genuine warmth, but Sophie knew better. Sophie and I have a wonderful relationship. When she stays with me on weekends, we go to nice restaurants, visit museums, go shopping for clothes and toys. I take her to movies and amusement parks. I want to give her experiences that will broaden her horizons. What he didn't mention was how those outings often felt more like photo opportunities than real fun. He would take pictures of them together and post them on social media, showing everyone what a great father he was. But during those trips, Sophie often felt like she was performing in a play, smiling for cameras while feeling empty inside. She remembered one trip to an expensive restaurant where she had accidentally knocked over her water glass. The water had spilled across the white tablecloth, and her father's face had turned red with embarrassment. He had grabbed her wrist under the table, squeezing hard enough to leave marks, while smiling at the waiter and apologizing for the clumsy child. "Children can be so careless," he had said with a laugh that sounded normal to everyone else but made Sophie's heart race with fear. Later in the car, he had told her that if she ever embarrassed him like that again, she would be in serious trouble. "Your Honor," Michael continued, "I believe children need structure and discipline to succeed in life. Lisa has always been too soft with Sophie, letting her get away with things that I would never tolerate. A child needs boundaries and consequences, not endless coddling." Sophie knew what her father meant by discipline and consequences. She knew about the times when she had been too loud or asked too many questions, and how his hand would come down hard on her arm or shoulder. He never hit her face. He was too smart for that. But her arms and back often had bruises that she learned to hide under long sleeves. "Sophie needs to learn respect and obedience," Michael said, looking directly at the judge. "In my house there are rules, and when those rules are broken, there are appropriate consequences. This is how children learn to function in the real world." The judge was nodding along, clearly impressed by Michael's talk of structure and discipline. In a world where many parents seemed too permissive, here was a father who understood the importance of boundaries and consequences. What the judge didn't know was that those consequences often came when Michael had been drinking and was angry about something completely unrelated to Sophie's behavior. She might get in trouble for leaving a toy on the floor, or for asking if she could call her mother, or for any number of small things that shouldn't have mattered at all. Sophie also knew about the phone calls. Late at night, when she was supposed to be sleeping, she would hear her father on the phone with her mother, his voice getting louder and angrier as the conversation went on. He would say terrible things about her mother, calling her names that made Sophie want to cover her ears. Sometimes he would threaten things that made Sophie so scared she would hide under her covers and cry silently into her pillow. "I want what's best for my daughter," Michael concluded, looking sincere and caring. "I can provide her with stability, opportunities, and the kind of structure she needs to grow into a successful adult. Her mother, despite her good intentions, simply cannot offer the same advantages." As Sophie watched her father paint this picture of himself as the perfect parent, she felt sick to her stomach. Everything he said sounded reasonable and caring to the adults in the courtroom, but she knew the truth that hid behind his polished presentation. She knew about the fear that lived in her chest during those weekend visits, and the relief she felt every Sunday evening when it was time to go back to her mother's small but safe apartment. The worst part was that no one would ever believe her if she tried to tell them the truth. Her father was too smart, too careful, too good at making himself look like the responsible adult while making her mother look unstable and unreliable. Judge Williams shuffled through the papers on his desk one final time, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. The courtroom had grown completely silent as everyone waited for his decision. Sophie could hear her own heartbeat drumming in her ears as she watched the judge prepare to speak. Her small hands gripped the edge of the wooden bench so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "After reviewing all the evidence presented today," Judge Williams began in his deep, authoritative voice, "I am prepared to make my preliminary ruling in this custody matter." Sophie's mom sat 3 rows behind her, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Her shoulders were hunched forward as if she was trying to make herself invisible. Sophie could see that her mom had already given up hope. The testimony had made it clear which way this decision was going to go. Her father sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, his posture straight and confident. He had loosened his tie slightly and was whispering something to Jennifer, who nodded and smiled. They looked like a couple who were about to receive good news, like people who had never doubted the outcome for even a moment. The court must consider what is in the best interests of the child, the judge continued, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. While both parents clearly love their daughter, the evidence shows a significant disparity in their ability to provide stability, educational opportunities, and financial security. Sophie felt her heart sinking with each word. She knew what was coming next, and she felt powerless to stop it. All around her, adults in expensive suits had spent the morning talking about her future, as if she were a piece of property to be awarded to the highest bidder. Nobody had asked her what she wanted. Nobody had asked her how she felt. Mr. Patterson has demonstrated financial stability, a suitable living environment, and the ability to provide educational and extracurricular opportunities that will benefit the child's development. He has remarried, providing a two-parent household with dual incomes and additional support systems. The judge paused to adjust his glasses and look at another document. Sophie could see her father's lawyer leaning back in his chair with a satisfied expression. This was exactly what they had expected to hear. Mrs. Patterson, while clearly devoted to her daughter, is currently experiencing financial difficulties and housing instability that could negatively impact the child's well-being and educational prospects. Sophie wanted to scream that it wasn't true. Yes, their apartment was small, but it was filled with love and laughter. Yes, her mom worked multiple jobs, but she never missed a school play or forgot to help with homework. The judge was reducing her entire life to numbers on paper and missing everything that really mattered. Therefore, it is the preliminary decision of this court that primary custody should be awarded to the father, with visitation rights granted to the mother on alternating weekends and one evening per week. The words hit Sophie like a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Behind her, she heard her mother let out a small, broken sob that made Sophie's heart feel like it was cracking in half. Her father was shaking hands with his lawyer, both men smiling broadly. Jennifer reached over and squeezed Michael's arm, looking pleased but trying not to appear too celebratory in front of the grieving mother across the room. Sophie's mind raced as she tried to process what this meant. She would have to live in that big cold house where she felt like a stranger. She would have to share space with Jennifer, who treated her like an interesting project rather than a real person. Worst of all, she would have to live with her father's anger and the fear that came with it, knowing that now there would be no escape back to her mother's safe embrace. But more than her own fear, Sophie was devastated by what this meant for her mom. She could see her mother's shoulders shaking as she cried silently into her hands. Her mom had fought so hard for her, had worked multiple jobs and sacrificed everything, only to have a room full of strangers decide that none of it was good enough. The judge was about to close the proceedings when something inside Sophie snapped. She couldn't sit there quietly anymore and let this terrible mistake happen. She couldn't let these adults make this decision based on lies and half-truths when she was the only one who knew what really went on behind closed doors. Without thinking about the consequences, Sophie stood up from her seat. The movement was sudden and unexpected, and it caught everyone's attention immediately. The quiet murmur of conversation that had started after the judge's ruling suddenly stopped completely. "Your Honor," someone called out, but Sophie was already moving. She walked toward the front of the courtroom on unsteady legs, her heart pounding so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. Every eye in the room was focused on her small figure as she made her way past the wooden benches and toward the judge's bench. "Someone stop her," she heard her father say sharply, but his voice sounded different now, worried and angry at the same time. Court officers started to move in her direction, but they seemed uncertain about how to handle the situation. She was just a little girl after all, not some dangerous criminal who needed to be tackled and restrained. They moved slowly, giving her time to reach the front of the courtroom. "Young lady," You need to return to your seat, Judge Williams said firmly, but not unkindly. He had seen emotional outbursts in custody cases before, and he understood that children sometimes couldn't handle the stress of legal proceedings. But Sophie didn't stop walking. She had found a courage she didn't know she possessed. A strength that came from knowing that this might be her only chance to tell the truth. All morning, she had watched adults talk about her life without including her voice. Now it was her turn to speak. "Your Honor, please," she said, her young voice surprisingly clear in the silent courtroom. "I need to tell you something important." Her father was half standing now, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "Sophie, sit down right now," he commanded in a voice that usually made her obey immediately out of fear. But something had changed. In Sophie. The fear was still there, but it was overpowered by something stronger, the knowledge that if she didn't speak up now, she might never get another chance. She thought about her mother crying in the back of the courtroom, and about all the nights she would have to spend in that house where she felt unsafe and unwanted. "I have something to say," Sophie repeated, looking directly at Judge Williams. Her voice was getting stronger with each word. "Everyone has been talking about me all morning, but nobody asked me what I want or what really happens when I'm not here." The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the court reporter had stopped typing and was staring at the small girl who had somehow commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Judge Williams looked uncertain for the first time all morning. This wasn't standard procedure, and he wasn't sure how to handle the situation. But there was something in Sophie's voice and posture that made him pause and really look at her for the first time. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "I know this is difficult, but these decisions are made by adults who understand what's best for—" "No," Sophie interrupted, her voice now steady and determined. "You don't understand what's best for me because you don't know the truth. Nobody in this room knows the truth except me." She took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything forever. The words felt heavy in her mouth, but she knew she had to say them. For her mother, for herself, and for the truth that had been hidden for too long. Looking directly into Judge Williams's eyes, 8-year-old Sophie spoke the 4 words that would turn the entire proceeding upside down. Sophie looked directly into Judge Williams's eyes and spoke the 4 words that would change everything. "He hurts me too." The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if someone had pressed a giant pause button on the entire courtroom. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody even seemed to blink. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded, and everyone was waiting to see what the damage would be. Judge Williams's face went completely white. In all his years on the bench, he had heard thousands of cases, but something about the way this little girl had spoken those simple words made his blood turn cold. There was no drama in her voice, no attempt to manipulate or perform. She had stated it like a simple fact, the way someone might say, "It's raining outside." "What did you say?" the judge asked quietly, leaning forward in his chair. Sophie's hands were shaking now, but her voice remained steady. "He hurts me too, just like he hurts my mom." The courtroom erupted. People started talking all at once. Chairs scraped against the floor, and camera phones started appearing despite the no photography rule. Michael jumped to his feet, his face red with anger and panic. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "She's just a confused child who's been coached by her mother. Your Honor, you can't possibly—" "Mr. Patterson, sit down immediately," Judge Williams commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos like a sword. "And everyone else, quiet down, or I'll clear this courtroom." The room fell silent again, but the tension was electric. Sophie could feel everyone staring at her, and for a moment her courage almost failed her. She wanted to run back to her seat and pretend she had never spoken. But then she looked at her mother, who was staring at her with a mixture of shock, fear, and something else. Hope. "Sophie," Judge Williams said gently, "I need you to tell me exactly what you mean by that. Can you do that for me?" Sophie nodded, though her throat felt dry and tight. "When I stay at his house on weekends, he gets angry sometimes. He drinks from bottles that smell bad, and then his voice gets different. Mean." "She's making this up," Michael interrupted again, but the judge silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. "Continue, Sophie," Judge Williams encouraged. "When he gets angry, he grabs my arms really hard, or he pushes me, or sometimes he hits me where people can't see." Sophie pulled up the sleeve of her dress slightly, revealing faded bruises on her upper arm. "He told me never to tell anyone, or something bad would happen to my mom." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Several people in the gallery stood up to get a better look, and the court reporter was typing furiously. Judge Williams immediately called for the court officers. "I want this courtroom cleared of all spectators except immediate family and legal counsel," he ordered. "And I want a court-appointed child advocate here within the hour." As people filed out of the courtroom, some grumbling about being removed, Sophie felt both relief and terror. She had finally told the truth, but now she wasn't sure what would happen next. Would anyone believe her? Would her father find a way to make her pay for speaking up? "Sophie," Judge Williams said once the room had cleared, "I'm going to ask you some more questions, but first I want you to know that you're safe here. Nobody is going to hurt you for telling the truth." Over the next hour, with a trained child advocate present, Sophie told her story. She talked about the bruises that she had learned to hide under long sleeves. She described the fear that lived in her stomach during weekend visits, and how she would count the hours until she could go back to her mother's apartment. She told them about the phone calls she had overheard, where her father would scream at her mother and say terrible things that made Sophie hide under her covers. She talked about his friends who came over when he had been drinking, and how uncomfortable they made her feel. "He always said nobody would believe me if I told," Sophie said quietly. "He said people would think I was lying because he looks like a good dad to everyone else." The child advocate, a kind woman named Dr. Rodriguez, asked gentle questions that helped Sophie explain things she didn't have words for before. She helped Sophie understand that what had been happening to her wasn't normal, and it definitely wasn't her fault. Michael's lawyer tried to argue that this was all coach testimony, that Lisa had put these ideas in Sophie's head to win the custody case. But when Dr. Rodriguez asked Sophie specific questions about the layout of her father's house, about conversations she had overheard, and about details that only someone who had lived through these experiences would know, it became clear that her story was painfully real. "Your Honor," Michael's lawyer said desperately, "my client has never been arrested or charged with any crime. There's no police record of domestic violence or child abuse. This is simply the word of a child against a respected member of the community." But Judge Williams had heard enough. He called for a recess and immediately ordered a full investigation. Within days, social workers were interviewing Sophie's teachers, who suddenly remembered times when she had seemed unusually quiet or had unexplained bruises. Her pediatrician was contacted and asked to review her medical records for any signs of abuse that might have been missed. The investigation also revealed something that made Judge Williams' blood boil. When authorities looked into Michael's background more carefully, they found 2 previous domestic violence calls to his address. Calls that had somehow been swept under the rug because of his connections and reputation in the community. Jennifer, his new wife, was also interviewed separately. When pressed by investigators, she admitted that she had seen Michael lose his temper with Sophie on several occasions, but she had convinced herself it was just normal parental discipline. She had been afraid to speak up because she was still in her probationary period at the hospital and couldn't afford to lose her job. "I knew something wasn't right," Jennifer finally admitted to investigators. "Sophie always seemed scared around him, especially when he had been drinking. But he told me she was just going through a difficult phase because of the divorce." The most damning evidence came when investigators examined Sophie's medical records more carefully. What had previously been explained away as normal childhood injuries, a bruised arm from falling off her bike, a sore shoulder from playing too rough, suddenly formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. 3 weeks after Sophie's brave moment in the courtroom, Judge Williams called everyone back for a final hearing. This time, the outcome was very different. "After a thorough investigation," Judge Williams began, "this court has found credible evidence of physical and emotional abuse. Mr. Patterson, you are hereby stripped of all custody rights pending criminal charges. Mrs. Patterson will retain full custody of her daughter." Michael's face crumpled as the reality hit him. His carefully constructed image as the perfect father had fallen apart completely. His lawyer frantically shuffled through papers, trying to find some way to appeal or delay the decision. But it was too late. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, I want to address something that has troubled me deeply about this case. This court almost made a terrible mistake based on superficial appearances and financial status. We almost sent a child back into an abusive situation because we failed to listen to the most important voice in this entire proceeding, the child herself. Sophie felt her mother's arms wrap around her from behind as Lisa finally allowed herself to cry tears of relief instead of despair. For the first time in months, Sophie felt truly safe. "Young lady," Judge Williams said, looking directly at Sophie, "your courage in speaking up not only saved yourself, but it may have saved other children in the future. This court will be implementing new procedures to ensure that children's voices are heard in custody cases." As they left the courthouse that day, Sophie walked between her mother and Dr. Rodriguez, who had become an important advocate and friend. The sun was shining for the first time in weeks, and Sophie felt like she could breathe freely again. Her 4 simple words, "He hurts me too," had changed everything. They had revealed the truth that adults had missed, and they had given her back her voice. Most importantly, they had brought her home to where she belonged, in the arms of someone who truly loved and protected her. Years later, Sophie would become an advocate for other children in similar situations, always remembering that sometimes the most powerful words are the simplest ones, spoken at exactly the right moment by someone brave enough to tell the truth.